Good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Megan Rust, Interpretation Director at the Frist Art Museum, and I'd like to thank you again for joining us for this evening's panel discussion, PATRIA y VIDA, Reflections on Art and Politics in Cuba, presented in partnership with the Center for Latin American, Caribbean, and Latinx Studies at Vanderbilt University. Closed captioning is available, and you can turn live captions on or off by using the controls at the bottom of your screen. We will begin with a land acknowledgement. The Frist Art Museum sits on land the Cherokee and Shawnee Native peoples, elders, and their ancestors call their homeland. We acknowledge and pay respect to them, and we offer deep gratitude and respect to the ancestral land and water that support us. Tonight's program is presented in conjunction with the exhibition On the Horizon, Contemporary Cuban Art from the Pérez Art Museum in Miami, now on view in our Ingram Gallery through May 1st. The Frist Art Museum acknowledges our supporters of this exhibition, Platinum sponsor HCA Healthcare TriStar Health, Education and Community Engagement supporter the Wingate Foundation, Hospitality sponsor Union Station Hotel, Spanish translation and program sponsor, the Center for Latin American, Caribbean, and Latinx Studies at Vanderbilt University. And On the Horizon is supported in part by our 2020 Frist Gala patrons. As always, we're grateful for the continued operating support from the Frist Foundation, the Metro Arts Commission, the Tennessee Arts Commission, and the National Endowment for the Arts. Before I turn it over to our moderator for this evening's panel discussion, I'd like to share a few reminders. At the end of the program, we'll take questions from the audience. We invite you to submit your questions using the Q&A feature anytime throughout the presentation. And thank you in advance for your patience with us as we present this program online. In the event of a technical difficulty, we'll pause the presentation and we'll work quickly to resolve the issue. If you're having technical difficulties on your personal device, please use the chat feature and send me a message, and I'll do my best to assist you. It's now my pleasure to introduce our moderator, Celso Castillo. Professor Castillo is the director of the Center for Latin American, Caribbean, and Latinx Studies and associate professor of history at Vanderbilt University. His research focuses on the political, cultural, and intellectual histories of modern Latin America. He received his doctorate from UC Berkeley, where he began work on slavery and abolition in Brazil. His first book, Slave Emancipation and Transformations in Brazilian Political Citizenship, received 3 prizes, including the 2018 Bolton Johnson Prize from the Conference of Latin American History for Best Book in the Field. He is currently working on 2 book-length monographs that broaden the scope of the cultural and intellectual histories of slavery in Afro-Latin America. Thank you so much, Professor Castillo, for moderating this evening's discussion.
Thank you, and good evening to everybody. It's a wonderful and immense honor to participate in this conversation. First, I'd like to acknowledge and thank again the Frist Art Museum for the exhibit, for Megan Rust in particular for the opportunity for this partnership in terms of this panel, and also in acknowledgement and recognition of a long-standing relationship and partnership that the center and the university more generally has had with the Frist. We're grateful in particular to the center, the Frist, the Art Museum, having hosted teachers' workshops earlier this month in turn of this exhibit, and for their efforts to increasingly use Spanish bilingual displays with their exhibits. So we find that important and a rich source of our collaborations. A little bit about the panel before I have the honor of introducing each of our guests. This panel is actually, take 2 or a second part of a conversation that we began in August, fall of 2021 here at Vanderbilt. It was actually an event that launched our center, and it literally occurred on the first day of classes in response to the massive marches and protests that erupted in Cuba on July 11th of 2021. It was a moment in the fall where it was imperative for us to reckon with and to engage the political situation as it was unfolding, to think more critically about art in particular as a space, as a form of the conversation as it was evolving. And it was also an opportunity for us to situate this specific moment in a longer context of where art and politics has been key to fostering and fomenting reflections and critiques about the state and society in Cuba over the last several decades. In particular, we discussed the San Isidro movement from 2018 that also galvanized around questions of freedom and expression through and about art. So this is that. While that happened in a moment, relatively soon after July 11th, and we were kind of still, figuring out how to grapple with it. Today's opportunity allows us to revisit some of these important questions. I mean, certainly with the added perspective of the time that has passed, and with more insight and benefit about how the situation and conversation continues to unfold. We are privileged to have three wonderful panelists who will join us today. One of the richest parts of their participation, in my view, is that they all share deep personal and professional connections to Cuba from a variety of different perspectives. So I think that intersection is particularly powerful, I think, in the nuance that we're going to hear tonight. So it's my pleasure first to introduce Dr. María Magdalena Campos-Pons, who is Cornelius Vanderbilt Endowed Chair of Fine Arts. She is a native of Matanzas, Cuba, whose work investigates themes of history, memory, gender, and religion in their shaping of identity. She is founder and director of the EADJ, which is the Engine for Art, Democracy, and Justice. It's an ongoing collaboration between Fisk University, the Frist Art Museum, Millions of Conversations, and Vanderbilt University. We are also joined this evening by David Plazas, who is Director of Opinion and Engagement for the USA Today Network. David is a journalist whose work appears in the Tennessean, and I say that I feel like I have a weekly connection to David through his Latino Tennessee Voices column that appears every Wednesday, and which I strongly urge you all to sign up for. This is an amazing exploration of both statewide Latino community formation and issues, and also a wonderful reference to similar kinds of journalism happening around the country, right? So he's also promoting the work of other journalists, Latino journalists in particular. So again, I strongly urge and recommend signing up for this newsletter. Earlier in his career, he founded the Gaceta Tropical in Southwest Florida, and he has lived in Tennessee since 2014. I failed to mention David is of both Cuban and Colombian background. We also have Luis Martínez, is a graduating senior at Vanderbilt University, who is double majoring in Spanish and Portuguese and minoring in Chinese language and culture. I'm proud to share with everybody tonight, and I didn't clear this for Luis before, but I hope that he's okay with this, that he's going to begin law school at UCLA in the fall, where he was admitted on a full tuition merit scholarship in the David Epstein program in public interest law and policy. Luis is involved in a myriad of different human rights and democracy oriented student and civil organizations. As a history major, Luis wrote an important paper entitled From Cuba to Miami, Queer Marielitos Before and After 1980, which has been accepted for publication at the University of Texas's undergraduate history journal. Luis is of Cuban and Venezuelan background, raised in Miami. So with that established, I will now pass on to a series of questions, initially one directed at each panelist, and then we will see how the kind of conversation and discussion unfolds. The first question is going to be for Magda, and if you would please talk about why the arts are an important space right now and in recent times for political dialogue and resistance in Cuba.
So well, and Luis and David, thank you for joining me today in this conversation, and my gratitude to the Pérez family for bringing this incredible exhibition to Nashville, and to the Frist Museum for hosting it. It's an incredible moment of celebration of Cuban art in our region. I would say, Celso, that the framing of why art in this particular moment could go even much earlier too. In the history of Cuban revolutionary movement and revolutionary ideas, art has been center stage. Jose Martí, who is considered the father, poet and literary figure of Cuban independent movement, was mostly known for his literary work in the lengua castellana, first that his revolutionary work as a warrior for Cuban independence. So I would say that the marriage of art as a space of creativity, as a space of inquiry, and as a space in which to inscribe the dissidents' positions, and as well the patriotic position from Cuban intellect and from Cuba people has been settled since very early in the formation of the Cuban nation. It's nothing new. What is happening now in this particular moment, and as I will say, that is a very strong the location that intellectual body of ideas that happen in Cuba have great stronghold within the arts, and from that and let me say, centering in visuality. For certain circumstances of the vehicle of the ways in which art builds itself, visual art have been centering itself and the artist through the visual art in the center of the conversation, alongside, I would say, filmmaker, writers, all of the above. But when you mentioned the movement San Isidro, it was some of the major figures were visual artists, alongside musicians as well, alongside other activists that come from literature and journalism. But I want to maybe go with the question around and thinking that in the way that art as methodology, as language, allowed for the position of question, of inquiries, of creating what I call difficult dialogues, and what I call presenting position of a clarity, of dissonant position that from other areas will be seen in a way that could be more confrontational. The language of visual art allow for a flexibility and a room, I would say, for presenting ideas with a more expansive and a more nuances for the discourse itself of the political position of thinkers. I want to give credit and also support to the individuals that have been part of the Movimiento San Isidro and other space of response that have been in Cuba, other activists in the space. I don't think that is only to Movimiento San Isidro. There are other voices that have been very vivid and important in trying to clarify and trying to be frontal and seeing with clarity and transparency the aspect of what I call of the promise of the so-called Movimiento Revolucionario, the revolution in Cuba, they have been disappearing. There is a moment of I will say, promises that are kind of evaporating, but also at the same time, individuals that are expressing their frustration with the shortcomings or the limitations that belong to the Cuban itself. They cannot be named or located in whatever is called the coming from outside or from aggression or for the kind of a constraint that the, let's say, relation with United States, etc., had been put to Cuba. That they are problems that are internal to Cuba that could have resolution within Cubans, and that is becoming places of contention and frustration. And the arts itself have been, and perhaps the area in which with more clarity, and I would say to courage, conversation that many times happen behind doors in Cuba has been put in the open platform of discourse that have access to the public in general. And to that, I think that is, at least from my part, as a visual artist myself, I want to say the importance and the pivotal role that literary, the visual art, and the artists in Cuba, and we use for this conversation PATRIA VIDA, which is a song, no, that emerged from this process of this content. But a lot of the ideas there had been marked and already inscribed early in other form of art. So I am seeing both art as a language that invite criticality, that invite analysis, that confront truth, harsh of soft, but trying to work and quest for the truth. And in that relation, centering itself as a fundamental vehicle to really see what happened in a society in a particular moment. That is why artists have such a fundamental and central role in the movement that took place and the event that took place in July 11.
Thank you. Thank you so much for bringing that larger perspective to bear. Let me pass on to David, and kind of drawing on your longstanding work in Tennessee, in the Greater South, about Latin America and Cuba more in particular. What are your thoughts about how this how this event, how these developments have played out in kind of U.S. journalism over now, right? I mean, there was an initial reaction and response, and now we're in March, right? So we're 8-9 months past that. What are your thoughts of how it's played out in the U.S. media and in journalism?
It's been very challenging because we have a situation in the United States where international news often doesn't make the headlines unless it's something like an invasion of Russia, of Ukraine. So Latin America, because of COVID, because of other factors such as the 2020 presidential election, and then of course higher inflation and so forth, it became distractions to what was going on in places like Cuba or Nicaragua or Colombia, where there are many things going on at this very time. But there was one bright spot when it came to coverage, and to repeat what Magda was saying, it's the cultural angle of it. So the song Patria Vida became a story unto itself last year, which was very exciting. And this is the song that basically juxtaposed that message of Patria Muerte, homeland or death, that was made some 60 plus years ago when the communist regime came to Cuba. And this song, which was created by Gente de Zona, Yotuel Romero, and also Desmer Bueno, it basically gives hope at a time of great desperation, where there was sickness through COVID, where there were food lines, or still issues of shortages of food, where there's issues of people wanting to leave the country. There's been a story in recent weeks about someone windsurfing to get a medical procedure done in South Florida, which shows the desperation of so many people. And this particular song that brought hope won 2 Latin Grammys. And that was one way of cultural exchange right there. It's unfortunate more of the political news didn't make it through. But, as journalists are actively covering this, I know that there are discussions about increasing the number of diplomats from the United States into Cuba. There was a huge news this past week about a court ruling regarding cruise lines, and apparently accused of illegally violating treaties, or at least trade law that we have here in the United States. And so from that standpoint, we're seeing news from sources like the Miami Herald or Al Jazeera or other places that specialize in that kind of news, but oftentimes with their own lens. But it did give me hope to see kind of universal praise and acceptance of that, the song Patria Viva.
Thank you so much, and for fleshing that out in particular about the song and its registers. Luis, so you have done research recently on political mobilization and questions in Cuba. How does this experience shape and influence the way you're processing what erupted last July?
Good evening, everyone. So just for context, I'm a first-generation Cuban Venezuelan American. I'm from Miami, but my late father was a Cuban immigrant who left his country as a young child, and my mother is a Venezuelan immigrant who left her country as an adult. So as I remember my dad on the one-year anniversary of his passing this week, I also think to the first convening of this panel back in August 2021, which was in the immediate aftermath of the July 2021 events, or the Once de Julio movement, which is intertwined with what Magda was discussing about the Movimiento San Isidro. And in that talk, I addressed how the historic protests had elicited drastic repressive measures from the Cuban government, which underscored the threat of the popular uprising to the regime. And I noted that by July 20th, 9 days after the first day of the protests, the number of detained and incarcerated Cubans had risen to 300 disappeared Cubans and 600 detained protesters. Many of these were young Black Cubans who had been forcefully taken from their families. After overviewing the protests and government responses, I discussed the geopolitical reverberations of these protests throughout the Americas, discussed Trump rules limiting flights as well as remittance payments from families abroad to Cubans on the island, the complex set of laws we refer to as the US embargo, and other factors that contributed to the sustained assault on the dignity of the Cuban people. Too many events have occurred between July and now for me to recount all of them in this brief talk. But I do want to note that the unjust trials of young children who partook in the protests have caused seething, yet necessarily muted, public uproar, as children of ages anywhere between 11 and 18 are being sentenced to years in prison by the Cuban government for exercising their rights to protest state repression and abuses. And in general, there's a general sentiment on the island right now that another Once de Julio is going to surge again before Once de Julio de 2022. So it's on the horizon. So that's something to keep in mind, especially given increasing inflationary pressures, pressures born of the continued effects of COVID-19 surges on the island, and pressure from the backlash to post-summer 2021 political sentiments. But in the rest of this talk, I'd like to point to a theme that can help illuminate what Cuba is experiencing today by situating it in a historical context. Cuba's authoritarian regime today reflects 5 centuries of autocratic, racist, and sexually oppressive paternalistic rule that has been responsible for a mass assault on human dignity on the island. Since the establishment of Spanish imperial rule on the island in the 16th century until its unique struggle for independence in the 1890s, Cuba, like most of Latin America, was subjected to patriarchal, absolutist, and racist monarchic rule. Following independence, this spilled over into Republican-era Cuba, as the caudillos who enforced their own forms of paternalistic autocracy shrugged at the notion of a constitution enshrining rights and placing constraints on their rule. In a post-boom Caribbean literature class I took with Professor William Luis, we studied Miguel Barnet and Esteban Montejo's work, Biografía de un Cimarrón. Esteban Montejo was a Black Cuban who freed himself from enslavement on a plantation before abolition, and then he fought in the Spanish-Cuban American War that ultimately led to Cuba's limited freedom from Spanish and US imperial grips. But as I trace this history of paternalistic racism and autocracy on the island, I note that we discussed as a class how Montejo bore witness throughout his life from 1860 to 1970. He lived a long life. He bore witness to the wealthy 19th century plantation owners, the corrupt generals who fought against Spanish rule later to foment their own ascendancy, and the abusive leaders of the nascent Cuban Republic. These are motifs that have pervaded Cuban history since the 1500s. And in my class, we noted how those 3 groups of racially, economically, politically, and sexually elite men sought to rise to power at different historical moments. The narrative content and structure of the memoir alludes to this continuity of abusive paternalism and racism. And I also note that the memoir alludes to how this spilled over yet again into revolutionary Cuba following 1959, both in terms of failing to ensure racial equality for Black and mixed Cubans on the island, to engaging in historical atrocities against gay Cubans like the UMAP re-education and labor camps after in the early 1960s. Revolutionary Cuba has been no exception to the structural racism and patriarchy that has pervaded earlier periods of Cuban history. So I emphasize that the legacy of paternalistic autocracy suffocating Cuba, whether through Díaz-Canel or the ghosts of Castro, Batista, Machado, or Ferdinand VII, is historically rooted. Much of what continues fueling the political, cultural, and sexual phenomena and anxieties of autocratic abuses, state repression, forced disappearances, militarism, cults of personality, and venality lies in the paternalistic authoritarianism we can still witness today. And I also want to urge us all to recognize that this kind of paternalism doesn't only emanate from Cuba's domestic government, but from geopolitical forces, such as the imperial influence the US has exerted over the island since the late 19th century in particular. Beyond the embargo, the US throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries played an outsized role in seeking to replace Spain as the paternalistic manager of Cuban political determination. The US resisted fully incorporating Cuba as a territory beyond protectorate status because of the fear that yet another Haiti or yet another Black Latin American republic would rise in the Caribbean, and engaged in a perpetual distortion of the Cuban nation and people as geopolitical bargaining chips. Most Cubans I speak with will tell you that the strongest and most immediate source of repression on the island is the government itself, but they also recognize the threat of old and new molds of hegemonic geopolitical imbalances that have affected the people and their national quest for democracy since the 1890s. None of these histories is simple, and I cannot nor am able to give an authoritative consideration of any aspect of these histories, but I do urge us all to consider the role of racist and paternalistic authoritarianism on the island in a historical understanding of where things stand today. And I also think that to begin responding to the paternalistic autocracy and to the people who toy with Cuba as if it were a significantly insignificant geopolitical marionette, I urge you to center Cuban voices, to combat anti-democratic paternalistic authoritarianism, and to work toward the perfection of accountability systems that prioritize racial, sexual, and democratic justice on the island today. Thank you.
Thanks, Luis. You know, in different ways, the three of you have access to and have participated in responses and dialogues on this matter within, let's say, kind of Cuban American space, right? And I think that one of the important things that we can, you know, continue doing in this session here is to distill the nuances and multidimensional and faceted and complex identities that form part of and voices that form part of kind of Cuban American society. So would the three of you, you know, share a little bit, maybe, you know, David, Luis, and then Magda, she's reconnecting here, how this is kind of played out from your own, you know, professional / personal viewpoints. Again, and what's interesting to retake this conversation is that, you know, we're here, you know, several months later, right? So like that kind of freshness is changing to something else. And so it'd be interesting to hear what the state of that conversation is like as you're experiencing it.
Sure. Thank you so much, Celso. My mother was born in Camagüey, Cuba, which is east of Havana, known as the land of the tinajones, the big pots that collect rain, and which I have one of those in my backyard as homage to my family. And she arrived with two of her siblings. She had to leave Cuba in 1963 without her parents because of a mistake in my grandmother's passport. So for nearly 8 months, they were with cousins in Mexico City as undocumented immigrants there. Their parents finally were able to come, and a few months later, they went to San Antonio and to Chicago because there was work there for my grandfather. And that's what drove him out there. My grandfather, you know, my family was a very Catholic religious family. aunt was a nun of the Order of the Salesian Sisters. And so for my grandfather, being able to worship freely, being able to take care of his family, being able to make decisions and own a business were very important to him, which is why he left. Now, this was before the different policies of the U.S. administration that favored Cubans to come to the United States. So they were treated very much in a system that saw Latin American immigrants as very new. If we remember in the 1960s, that was incredibly new to see so many Latin Americans coming in because of racist policies regarding people outside of Northern Europe. So my mother has lived here. She's never gone back to Cuba. I have not had a chance myself to go to Cuba, although several relatives have. And what they've seen is when they have returned the last couple of decades, they've been saddened by how different it is, how dilapidated many of the homes are. Although there is a sense of commerce, Airbnb is in Cuba, but it's even fresh fruits. And when I think of growing, living in South Florida for so long and being able to get a pastel de guayaba or a batido de mamey, you can't get that fresh fruit in Cuba today because of many of these trade policies that limit supplies coming in. Certainly the Castro administration and its efforts to force sugar upon the entire island at a detriment to other crops. And those things, in terms of our relationship with our Cuban relatives, it's been about trying to get as many dollars as possible, initially illicitly, and then through the economy that now accepts dollars kind of with a wink and in some cases officially. So it's been very interesting, both from my experiences in Chicago and then in Florida, to see a very different sort of politics, because the Chicago side was more about, we need to work. There's not a very large community. Miami area, of course, has a much larger Cuban community, and it was much more politically organized, and especially with opposition to the Castro administration. Here in Tennessee, it's very interesting. The Latino population itself was almost zero in 1980, and it has grown precipitously since that time. In fact, in 2010, Latinos made up about 4% of the population. The latest census shows that Latinos are nearly 7%. And we know from recent reports that census has undercounted Latinos. So this is just the official numbers that we have. In 94 of 95 counties across Tennessee, Latinos have seen tremendous growth, especially in Middle Tennessee. And the Cuban population has, many of Cubans that I've met and spoken to have, in some cases, have been here for decades. Politically, I have tended to be more conservative Republican, and we have certainly seen an interesting shift in the last election cycle, not only of Cubans, but also of Mexicans in the border of Texas and Mexico, the Mexican Americans, to be more conservative. A lot of it is because of those so-called traditional values. What has been interesting as well, though, has been the activism when it's come to, pan-Latin American collaboration. In Florida is a place where you have also a very politically active Puerto Rican population, which has certainly influenced and tends to be more democratic and has influenced the politics there as well. And where I lived in Southwest Florida tended to be more Republican, but at the same time, there was this very interesting trend that I saw. You had, in a sense, a xenophobic trend, but a pro-Cuban refugee trend as well at the same time. And while there were inconsistencies, a lot of this, I think had to do back with policies in the 1990s. If you all remember, Jesse Helms, who was Foreign Relations Committee chairman for a while, had crafted some policies that were very repressive, and that also allowed Cubans to sue for their property in Cuba for those who had left the island. So it's been a very interesting issue, because as a Colombian Cuban American, I feel very disconnected in many ways from people who've had that experience of struggle. My mother certainly has had that experience, and what I have tried to do as a journalist is to tell those stories. And I think one of the things that we saw in recent years, one very interesting thing, I'll conclude with this, is that there was a conversation in Tennessee, which has the legislature has tended to be hostile toward refugees of all countries coming in. And one conservative ally of Governor Lee, a Cuban American named Raul Lopez, stood up and told his story of being a refugee. And the audience was just awed by the fact that someone who they thought was just one of us was in fact had that experience. And I think telling those stories is really important to help people gain empathy and hopefully be more welcoming. And we'll see. Now we've had Afghan refugees coming in. We may see Ukrainian refugees coming in as well. but we have a very similar story in that case. And the children, Luis and I, in many cases, are in the middle of sorts. We're neither here nor there when it comes to identity. So trying to figure out what that is means that we belong everywhere but nowhere, and allows us to be really good observers of what is happening in those worlds.
And thank you so much for that. And I think that the overview and the geographic and social differences is so important for us to always kind of consider as we draw up understandings and assumptions sometimes about groups and politics and whatnot. Luis, what about how has this kind of played out in your context?
Can Magda talk?
I think so. Maybe, or we can go to, maybe you can start and I can go back to Magda. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Maybe giving it a second to see if it does kind of come back and.
Okay. Could you repeat your question?
No problem. No, I mean it's kind of following up along these lines of how conversations and reflections on what happened last summer has played out within your kind of slice and areas of kind of Cuban American and Latino more generally community.
Yeah. Since last July, I think there's been, well, I'll just speak to this personally because it's what I can best speak to. Since I was a little kid, the idea of any kind of manifestation or protest on the Cuban island was something that just was inconceivable. I have friends in attendance on this Zoom call who must understand what I mean by the fact that thinking about like something after the Maleconazo, another powerful show of social opposition to the regime, that just seemed inconceivable because of the kinds of repressive measures people could expect to have been met with had they executed one of those protests. So this kind of it shattered the veneer, honestly, on expectations of what can happen next. It seemed like to an outsider, witnessing like these processes on the island, like it must have seemed like Cuba was stuck in a sort of historical trance, and this sort of not particularly specific post-Cold War geopolitical funnel. And now it seems like maybe we're just realizing it since it's like been amplified since July 2021. But it seems like there's more potential for forward movements on this. And personally speaking, I had never seen any news from Cuba that rattled me or shocked me the way the news from July 2021 affected me, because ultimately, like, that's not something you expect. And the exile community responded accordingly. The exile and recent immigrant community. It's not just like the 1950s exiles, that there are numerous, very complex and nuanced like waves of Cubans, including Cubans my age who came a year ago, filling the streets of Miami, and they're not really counted in censuses or whatnot. So besides Latin people being undercounted in general, like David mentioned. So I think it's just really important that the imaginary of exile and the imaginary within the island nation, like these are starting to like open up and intersect in ways that are propitious to further social action taken. Unfortunately, what's going to follow that kind of social action is really more kind of judicial repression from the Cuban state, if the same thing happens where they're sentencing children to 10 years in prison. But it's the awareness is what we need to be promoting, honestly, because that degree of suffering warrants like an equally or stronger response. So
thank you. Trying to see here if we can see Magda. Has she been able to, can you hear us, Magda?
I think we've lost her.
We did. Okay. So we'll okay, well, maybe might be able to resume in a couple of minutes. One kind of other interesting common denominator among the three of you has to do with your involvement in an engagement of social questions, both as they pertain to our immediate context and as they pertain to the Cuban context, right? I mean that broad, like interest and just right understanding about And I'm kind of curious if in your minds and your actions and your activities, if there have been kind of connections drawn between what might be seemingly different worlds, right? If as a result, in particular, of what happened last summer, if lessons learned isn't the word, but inspirations or visions or perspectives on local questions that may be informed by your understanding and your readings of what's happened in Cuba.
You know what? One of the things I want to talk about just very quickly is Magda's, one of her most compelling works from the Frist Museum, and it's related to this. And it's 3 flowers that are next to each other that are very brightly colored. And it's to talk about the Breonna Taylor murder by police who went into her house without a warrant. And it talks about those things that Luis had mentioned before about the really the violation of people's rights, basic rights to live and basic rights to be free. We saw that a couple of years ago with the racial reckoning protests, that people were demanding to be seen, demanding equal justice, and there's a parallel there. There has been, unfortunately, as we've seen in this country, some fatigue when it comes to people, fighting for racial justice and their own dignity. We see it even in the conversations around the nomination of or the confirmation hearings of Judge Ketanji Brown Jackson. And so I think what we need to do as people who are very much engaged is to continue to tell those stories, to try to find different ways to find people where they're at, to be able to make those stories more palatable, not to water them down by any means, but to ensure that people can remain empathetic, because these things are real. But from a journalist standpoint, it hurts my heart when I receive a newsletter from the National Press Club every day, and we see news about journalists being killed, whether it's in Mexico or the Ukraine. The question is, what can we do to keep that around for people who are exercising their basic right and dignity to speak up? News reports recently show that dozens of protesters from July 11th have been prosecuted. They will remain in prison for who knows how long. We're in a situation where they deserve to be heard, and what can we do to pressure, from a standpoint from civil society, to pressure our leaders to say this is not right. If we truly believe in a human rights policy, we have to do something about this and can't stand back. Ironically, we are the most incarcerated country in the world, so we have that we also have to face ourselves. Just that terrible legacy. I'll leave this a recommendation for people. If you haven't been to the Legacy Museum in Montgomery, Alabama, it's a beautiful, beautiful museum, and chilling and haunting, because it talks about the issues of the slave trade and how it came through places like Cuba and elsewhere, and both the international slave trade and the domestic ones. But it starts to explain those geopolitical factors that Luis was talking about earlier, in terms of why we subjugate certain people and why we continue to have attitudes that are often negative toward Afro-Latinos or African Americans.
Thank you. Magda, can you hear us? Would you be able to?
I am here and I am
wonderful.
seeing you, but I have been having this absolutely unexpected problem with, okay, here I am. So
Wonderful.
My apologies for this.
No. So
something catastrophic happened.
We're good.
But I have been here, what the discussion has gone, and what I want to add, and thank you for this comment about my piece in the exhibition. And I am thinking that this topic and this conversation around the role of art as a commentator of social instability, and as a commentator of a register of the temperature of a nation, of a population, is very important. And it has been to the history of Cuba, and is very present now. But I also want to make a space for consideration of the nuances of that territory, and the nuances, what I call to the right of staying quiet, not because you are accepting, but because you are considering and giving a thought to what are the best way of action. And I am thinking that, and I miss trying to come back to the conversation if you seen the word share, but I am thinking about the artists. They are not necessarily expressing to their work a confrontational response with each of their discontent, but they are actively participating for a transformative space that is happening in some areas quiet in Cuba. And I want to open to an observation, and at least in a space of consideration of that. I don't think that the changes that are necessarily and that is happening in Cuba are going to come just only from the very radical, open, frontal opposition to the regime, and opposition for the things that are happening within the regime right now that are disquiet and that are unacceptable, but as well from the people that are using a subtle and possible, I would not describe it, but many other ways to embrace and to counter propose actions and possibility of thinking and existing. Resistance is not only going and screaming on the street. Resistance could have many forms of presentation. Opposition is not only presented and expose the body to extreme. There are incredible opposition that is from quiet spaces, and I want to really claim to that space and to think about what I have said many times. Not only the people that express opposition openly and painfully for that entire years that I have of life, which have been living the country, and also in every time that many of the Cubans that leave the country in a way of crossing the stretch of Florida is literally a revolutionary gesture, because they risking their life over and over and over again. As we talk now, somebody's trying to leave Cuba. That is the dynamic of that is happening, and those are very large gesture. I was talking with a colleague in Cuba a few days ago and sent me this data. 16,000 Cubans left the country last month. 16,000. That is a big number for an island of a population of 10 close to 11 million. The fact that this is a continuous stream of people expressing opposition and expressing discontent is important. I also think the space that the artists open of visibility for other people to be able as well to find an area of represent and openly discuss, their discontent, or at least two. I want to give Cuban two agency, their own agency, to decide what and how they going to change their predicament in the island. Luis was talking earlier about the impact of imperial and geopolitical maneuvers over Cuba. For all of us, they have been follow history of Cuba and history of American relation with Cuba. American is still on a piece of Cuba that doesn't belong to it, Guantanamo Bay. I mean, these are real issues too that are important and that we could not just throw away and disregard it. The right of a self-determination, the right of self-government is something that the Cuban need to decide on their own terms, and the complexity of the layers of history that exist in that nation are extraordinary. So I see the art as a teaching tool as well. I see the art and the labor of the artist as through expression, as delivering and giving to people and the population access to information and history that sometimes becomes sediment and it's not become as visible as is needed. There is an incredible coalition in the history of revolutionary Cuba and the work of artists. poets are in the center of every moment in the history of Cuba. There was a fight and a desire for a better Cuba. So, and this has been, and I am not an historian. my passion for this is my love for Cuba and my appreciation for the richness and value of Cuban culture. Even in the moment of incredible despair, as it was and as it is right now, and in the time around July 11, when in my city, in the city that I was born, with my living family still there, people were dying in the alleys of the hospital, and people were dying because they didn't have medicine to counteract COVID or food or service. No, so in the middle of that, people were making art. People were creating songs. People were creating paintings and performance that spoke about, restorative energy to keep calling and accessing agency for a better Cuba. So in my romantic taking, and I always have described myself in my relation to Cuba as a romantic one. I have been living now more in America than in Cuba, but I am still feel my heart is exactly divided in half. I love and owe so much to this nation, United States, and I love and owe so much to Cuba that I can know I live in this context, these two lovers, these two passions. And I am thinking that it's important to give a space to the people who never going to leave Cuba because cannot imagine. And so there is all that. What is for them? How do we help or assist or open dialogue and conversation? So from my position at Vanderbilt, from my position as a maker, as an artist, is how do we foster dialogues, people to people? How do we open windows in which people of Cuba could access real conversation with counterpart, not only from the United States, from the world? So I am a big defender of art as an inviting table, a table in which in two sides of that bit piece of wood, of glass, or plastic, whatever that table is made of, people from the two sides could sit down and over a meal discuss, come to terms, and access possibility of amendment and possibility of how do we foster a better Cuba, an independent Cuba. I mean, we are in the middle of what is happening now in the world, and David was speaking about that. For somebody like myself who born in Cuba after Castro, what happened now in Ukraine is extraordinary, because exactly seeing the aggressor that was, Russia coming. Russia was in Cuba since I was born and until I left. And those are very pivotal moments. And I wonder what kind of responses, what kind of ideas and projects are we going to see it out of Cuba? I am most certain from this corner that the people of Cuba, I don't talk about the government, the people of Cuba, the moms and dads and the sister and brothers and uncle and the guys in the corner, trying to figure out how they're going to eat tomorrow, they are in the side of the Ukrainian. They are in the side of the people defending democracy and freedom. They are in the side of the people defending dreams, because this had been a fundamental definition of Cuban. Cubans are fighters, and Cubans are people who build an extraordinary, prosperous, and rich country. So the decimation that we have seen in Cuba in this period, for all the elements that have brought that to place, we are in the moment in which all this is, I sure, under evaluation by Cubans, not only in the diaspora, but in the country, big time. And what the artists are doing, art is always the witness and the place in which what is happened before and after get inscribed. Artists see ahead, and when artists signal something, put attention because it's coming.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. We so also just kind of keeping an eye on the clock, and I wanted to thank and acknowledge the people that have started to submit some questions. I think as Magda was talking, she actually hit on several of the points that Deborah raised about kind of on the ground thinking, on the ground hope, and on the ground thoughts about the future. I think Magda did a wonderful job in suggesting art as a point of dialogue and as a basis of more conversation. I want to pose the question here that Lily wrote in about race and the intersection of race, art, and repression. If whoever wants to take this up.
I mean, I think that Luis did a good job speaking about the history of race and repression in Cuba. I have a very contentious position from that, being the Black Cuban woman in this conversation. But often in my own life, I have found myself being the only Black Cuban woman in many constituencies. So there is one important thing. I will say there is no Cuban culture without negritude. And that negritude, and I want to use negritude and Creole rather than Cuba as term to refer to that, define Cuban culture in big time. But also you're going to see before and after, before I was born and after I was born, that Cuban creolite, should I go in that side, of Cuban Blacks still constitute the minority. In the colonial period, when the city of Matanzas becomes the largest populated city of Black Cuban in the island, and for a period of time, the Black population of Cuba overcome the white population of Cuba, the colonial rule built the city of Cienfuegos. Cienfuegos was built to whiten Cuba. I don't think that a lot has changed. The whitening of Cuba and the implication of the racial aspect that this brings is still very present, is still true, is still complex, and in this moment, very fragile. In the very front of the fight for Cuban betterment are a lot of Black bodies, and that is poignant.
David, you were talking about the coverage of the U.S. media of the protests and the aftermath and the kind of honing in on culture, right, and the song itself. Drawing on this question here about race, and we can add Blackness to it more specifically. How do you find that those issues being parsed out in kind of the U.S. media to the extent that I know we're generalizing and lumping a lot of things together, but nonetheless, like, is it a point of wider discussion? What's your take on that?
Absolutely. And just a quick point of history, in 1968, the Johnson administration had commissioned what was known as the Kerner Commission, which showed that a lot of the issues related to strife and violence in the United States was race-related, very complicated, but it also said that the press was responsible in many cases for having to foment those divisions. And 54 years later, we haven't made a lot of progress. And part of it is making sure that we have a newsroom that represents the people in our communities, which we have just started to do in terms of my company itself. And that often skews the storyline itself. And the other is making sure that we don't tell stories just about people of color, but tell stories for and with. So it's not just telling it from our lens, but from the lens of people themselves through their own storytelling. I had a professor in college in one of my Latin American history classes, literature classes, named Hugo Achugar, who used to talk about angustia ontológica, or the angst of identity, the very fact that we as Latinos reflects so many different, that spectrum of color from very white to very dark. And oftentimes they're at odds with each other. And the caste system that we've seen all over Latin America, which is different than the caste system that exists in the United States. One of the most interesting things about it was the fact of this obsession with, if you were a person of color, an indigenous person who married a Black person, or if you were a Black person who married a white person, how your ranking would change, your ranking in society. And I think that we still have the legacy of that we're contending with. My hope is with exhibitions at the Frist, like Magda's, that we'll continue to do this. My biggest concern as a journalist has been, from my own experience, 20 plus years in the business, is that we will have this moment of this aha moment, and then we'll move on. And my hope is that art like this will continue to inspire people to create more art, and especially with the conversation about negritude, will inspire artists of color to tell those stories. And PATRIA VIDA is certainly a reflection of that, of Black and brown Cuban artists who are giving voice to people who feel very marginalized and disconnected, but are willing to use their voices to the point of harm to their bodies to be heard. And I hope that continues.
Thanks. Luis, if you want to bring it home for us, you definitely have a lot of deep insights into this, both on your work on Cuba, on your honors thesis. So how do you situate, I mean, this question specifically vis-a-vis last July?
I'm not sure if you'd mind my kind of like connections with Brazil, but this is more improvised than anything. Some of you might know that I've been working with Professor Castilho on my honors thesis recently, considering how newspapers have been reconceiving of racial justice in a post-dictatorship Brazilian terrain. And I think it's really complicated, because think about all the layers of positionality we're embodying right now. We're speaking as people who have different kinds of connections to Latin America at an American research university in Tennessee, X many miles away from Cuba, while certain things are happening in Cuba, and there are all these other barriers mediating our conversations and discourses between the United States and Cuba. So let's just keep all that in mind. But ultimately, I think that if anything, like what I've studied in these 4 years of undergrad here at Vanderbilt has shown me that race is constructed extremely differently between the US imaginary and the post-colonial / post-imperial Spanish American or Portuguese American and modern Brazilian imaginaries. And race, I'm just going to echo ultimately what Magda expressed about race, that I'm a white Latino, but it's really clear even to the whitest Latinos that race is something that is inextricable from like a broader image of justice in Latin America, from a broader image of Latin American history, from an understanding of how social change and transformations occur in Latin American history and Cuban culture. I'll just end with an anecdote to just go to this point. When I was a little kid, my dad, my late dad, he was a santero. So he would practice Santeria, which is an Afro-Cuban syncretic religion. And when I was a little kid, he would take me into this closet every morning with a staff and beads of different colors. And he would teach me Yoruban prayers. And I'd do this every morning with him. And I grew up not even knowing what that meant, what that was, or anything like that. My dad was kind of like subconsciously guiding me into like the lifelong practice of like an Afro-Cuban syncretic religion. And we're pretty much like the whitest Latin people you'll find in terms of like skin hue. And so that's just like a small testament to like how deeply like race and different conceptions of race and like racial processes over time have perforated the Latin American imaginary and reality. So everything I said about Cuba and systemic rights abuses, I address like the sexual layer of paternalistic rights crises, but it's first and foremost like a racial crisis layer from the inception of Cuba as a Spanish colony through today. So,
Luis, could I say something to that? And to say once, I am sure that I could be almost your mother by age. which is beautiful. And I would love you as a son too. So brilliant. And here you had just put something quite wonderful in the conversation. Here is a white Cuban who is introduced to the secret of Black Cuban with such a purity. And the most visible babalaos, the top, in Cuba now, are white at this particular moment. And then in this table that I want to sit all of us together, a conversation about the no question acceptance of whiteness into the conversation of the Blackness in Cuba, especially in Cuba, when you are so right that it's different, that the problematization of race in America and the still limitations and similarity of Blackness being and seeing and position in the war that we have not resolved. That this, I would love to think that I want to start a new conversation with you. What is that about? That Black people embrace whiteness into itself as a sister and brother and a father and a God, a babalao, but still an incredible, uneven discrimination toward Blackness still present in Cuba today, when we, the dark Black people, never dared to disrupt that a babalao could be a guy as white as coconut milk.
Thank you, Magda and Luis. I think Megan is going to rejoin us.
Thank you all so much for this important conversation and helping contextualize the work that we have on view at the Frist Art Museum in current events and in history and in geopolitics. And thank you all for joining us this evening. We hope to see you in person at the Frist Art Museum to see on the horizon contemporary Cuban art from the Pérez Art Museum Miami. It is open until May 1st, so we hope you'll come and see the important work, including works by María Magdalena Campos-Pons. So thank you again for joining us, and we hope you have a great night.
Thank you all. Thank you, panelists, dear friends, colleagues.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.